Hey everyone, today I'm going to tell you a story that's been consuming my life for the past year. It's a story about greed, corruption, and an HOA that tried to steal my family's land, so buckle up, because this is going to be a wild ride. Let me take you back to where it all began, my grandpa's land. To understand why this fight means so much to me, you need to understand what this land represents. It's not just a piece of property, it's a living, breathing part of my family's history. My grandpa, Joseph, was the kind of man who could fix anything with his hands and a little bit of duct tape. He wasn't rich, but he was proud of what he had. He bought those 5 acres back in the 1960s when land was cheap, and he spent years turning it into a place where his family could gather and make memories. I remember the first time he took me out there. I was maybe 6 years old, and he held my hand as we walked through the tall trees. "See that creek over there?" he said, pointing to the little stream that cut through the property. "That's where I taught your dad to fish. And one day, I'll teach you too." And he did. Over the years, that land became my second home. We had family reunions there, with cousins running through the woods and grandparents sitting around the fire telling stories. My siblings and I built forts out of fallen branches and pretended we were explorers discovering new worlds. My grandpa would sit on an old tree stump, whittling pieces of wood into little animals, and tell us about the history of the land. When my grandpa passed away 3 years ago, it hit us all hard. But he left us the land, and with it, a piece of himself. In his will, he wrote, "This land is for my family. Keep it safe, keep it whole, and never let anyone take it from you." Those words would come to mean more than I ever imagined. Fast forward to about a year ago. I was going through my mail one day when I saw a letter from something called the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. I'd never heard of them before, so I opened it curious. The letter was weird. It started with this overly formal tone, like it was written by someone who'd swallowed a dictionary. "Dear property owner," it began. "It has come to our attention that your property is not in compliance with Cedar Ridge community standards." I laughed. What standards? The land was just trees and a creek. There wasn't even a house on it. The letter went on to say that we needed to maintain the property to prevent it from becoming an eyesore, and that we were required to comply with all HOA bylaws. At the bottom, there was a list of fines we'd face if we didn't take action. I showed the letter to my dad, and he just rolled his eyes. "Ignore it," he said. "We're not part of their HOA. They can't tell us what to do." So that's what we did. We ignored it. But the HOA didn't give up. A few weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was more aggressive. "Failure to comply with community standards will result in further action," it said. They even included a photo of our land, with red circles around areas they claimed were overgrown and unsightly. I couldn't believe it. Overgrown? It's called nature. We decided to respond this time. My dad drafted a polite letter explaining that we weren't part of the HOA and included a copy of our deed to prove it. We thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The letters kept coming. Each one was more threatening than the last. They accused us of violating community bylaws. Yes, they misspelled violating, and threatened to take legal action if we didn't comply. At this point, we were frustrated, but still not too worried. We knew we weren't part of the HOA, and we had the paperwork to prove it. Then, one day, everything changed. I was at work when my dad called me. His voice was shaking. "You need to come home," he said. Now, when I got there, he handed me a letter from the county. It said our land was being rezoned as part of the Cedar Ridge HOA's community expansion plan. I was confused. "What does this mean?" I asked. "It means they're trying to take our land," my dad said. We spent the next few days digging through paperwork and making phone calls. That's when we discovered the truth. The HOA had submitted documents to the county claiming we'd signed over the land to them. And here's the kicker. They'd forged my grandpa's signature. My grandpa, who had been dead for 3 years. I've never felt so angry in my life. How dare they? How dare they try to steal our land and use my grandpa's name to do it? We knew we had to fight back. The first thing we did was hire a lawyer. His name was Mark, and he specialized in property disputes. When we showed him the forged documents, he was just as shocked as we were. "This is one of the most blatant cases of fraud I've ever seen," he said. Mark helped us file a complaint with the county and demanded an investigation. But the HOA didn't back down. They hired their own lawyer, some slick, expensive guy who tried to gaslight us into thinking we were the ones committing fraud. It was infuriating. Looking back, I can't believe how naive we were. We thought the HOA was just being annoying. We never imagined they'd go this far. But this was just the beginning. In part 2, I'll tell you about the legal battle, the HOA's shady connections, and how we took the fight public. Until then, let me know in the comments, have you ever dealt with an HOA? What would you do in our situation? After discovering the forged documents, we knew we had to act fast. Our lawyer, Mark, was confident we had a strong case, but he warned us it wouldn't be easy. HOAs have a lot of power, he said, and they're not afraid to use it. The first step was filing a formal complaint with the county. Mark helped us gather all the evidence. The forged documents, copies of our deed, and even a handwriting expert's report proving the signature wasn't my grandpa's. But the HOA wasn't going down without a fight. They hired their own lawyer, a guy named Richard who wore expensive suits and had a way of talking that made you feel like you were the one in the wrong. Our first meeting with Richard was something else. He sat across from us in his fancy office, smirking like he'd already won. Your grandfather verbally agreed to transfer the land to the HO, he said. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My grandpa hated HOAs, I shot back. He would never agree to that. Richard just shrugged. That's your word against ours. As the legal battle dragged on, we started to notice something strange. Every time we made progress, there was some new obstacle. Documents would go missing, hearings would get postponed, and the county officials seemed uncooperative. That's when we started digging deeper. Turns out, the HOA president, a guy named Greg, was buddies with someone in the county zoning office. His name was Tom, and he'd been working with Greg to push through the rezoning paperwork. We found emails between them, thanks to a tip from a whistleblower that showed just how deep the corruption went. In one email, Greg wrote, "We need to get this done before the family catches on." It was infuriating. These people were supposed to be public servants, but they were working with the HOA to steal our land. We knew we couldn't fight this battle alone. So we decided to take the story to the local news. At first, the reporters were skeptical. HOAs are tricky, one of them told us. People don't usually want to touch these stories. But when we showed them the forged documents and the emails, they were hooked. The story aired on a Tuesday night. By Wednesday morning, our phones were blowing up. People were outraged, not just in our community, but all over the country. Even some of the HOA members were shocked. One of them, a sweet older lady named Margaret, called us to apologize. "I had no idea this was happening," she said. "If I'd known, I would have done something." The public outcry put a lot of pressure on the HOA and the county. Suddenly, they weren't so confident anymore. But the HOA wasn't going to give up that easily. They launched a smear campaign against us, spreading rumors that we were trying to exploit the land for profit. They even held a community meeting to rally support. Greg stood up in front of everyone and said, "This family is trying to destroy our community. We can't let them win." It was surreal. Here we were, just trying to protect our family's land, and they were painting us as the villains. This whole ordeal has taken a huge toll on my family. My dad's health has been declining from the stress, and my mom can't sleep at night. We've spent thousands of dollars on legal fees, and there's no end in sight. But we're not giving up. This land is my grandpa's legacy, and we're not letting anyone take it from us. Just when it felt like we were hitting wall after wall, something incredible happened. We got a call from someone who wanted to remain anonymous. Let's call them Sam. Sam worked in the county zoning office and had seen everything that was going on. They were disgusted by the corruption and wanted to help us. "I can't stand by and watch this happen," Sam said. "I have evidence that will blow this case wide open." A few days later, we met Sam in a quiet parking lot. They handed us a USB drive filled with emails, internal memos, and even recorded conversations between Greg, the HOA president, and Tom, the county official. It was a goldmine. The evidence Sam gave us was damning. There were emails where Greg and Tom discussed how to fast-track the rezoning paperwork. There were memos where Tom instructed his staff to lose certain documents. And there were recordings of Greg bragging about how he'd taken care of other property disputes in the past. But the most shocking thing was a conversation where Greg and Tom talked about forging my grandpa's signature. "We just need to make it look convincing," Greg said. "Once it's done, there's no way they can prove it's fake." Hearing those words made my blood boil. But it also gave us hope. This was the proof we needed to expose the HOA's corruption once and for all. We knew we had to act fast. Mark, our lawyer, helped us file a motion to present the new evidence in court. But we didn't stop there. We reached out to the local news again. This time, they were even more interested. The story made headlines: HOA president and county official caught in land grab scandal. The public reaction was overwhelming. People were furious. Even those who had supported the HOA before started to question what was really going on. As the pressure mounted, Theo started to panic. Greg held another community meeting, but this time, it didn't go as planned. People were angry. They wanted answers. "How could you do this?" one woman shouted. "We trusted you." Greg tried to defend himself, but it was no use. The evidence was too strong. A few days later, we got word that Tom had been placed on administrative leave. The county was launching an investigation into the zoning office. It felt like a victory, but we knew the fight wasn't over yet. This whole ordeal has been a roller coaster of emotions. There are moments when I feel like we're finally winning, and then there are moments when I'm overwhelmed by the stress and exhaustion. My dad's health is still a concern, and the legal fees keep piling up. But we're not giving up. The night before the court hearing was one of the most surreal nights of my life. My family gathered at my parents' house, sitting around the kitchen table with stacks of paperwork, notes, and evidence spread out in front of us. The air was thick with tension, but there was also a sense of determination. We'd come too far to back down now. My dad, who had been quiet for most of the process, finally broke the silence. "No matter what happens tomorrow," he said, his voice steady but emotional, "I'm proud of us. We fought for what's right, and that's what matters." My mom reached over and squeezed his hand. "Your grandpa would be proud too," she said, looking at me. "He always said this land was for the family. We're honoring his wishes." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. My grandpa had always been the backbone of our family, and this fight felt like a way to keep his spirit alive. We spent the next few hours going over everything one last time: the forged documents, the whistleblower's evidence, the timeline of events, and the key points Mark, our lawyer, planned to make in court. By the time we finished, it was late, but none of us could sleep. The morning of the hearing was a blur. I woke up early, my stomach in knots, and spent way too long trying to decide what to wear. I wanted to look professional but also approachable, like someone the judge would believe. When we arrived at the courthouse, I was shocked by how many people were there. News cameras were lined up outside, and the gallery was packed with people from the community. Some were there to support us, while others were clearly on the HOA's side. Greg, the HOA president, was there with his lawyer, Richard. They looked confident, but I could tell they were nervous. Greg kept adjusting his tie and glancing at the door, while Richard was flipping through a stack of papers like he was cramming for a test. Mark, our lawyer, greeted us with a reassuring smile. "We've got this," he said. "Just stick to the facts, and let the evidence speak for itself." The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, called the court to order. "This is a case about property rights, fraud, and corruption," she said. "Let's get to the truth." Mark presented our case first. He walked the judge through the forged documents, explaining how the HOA had submitted paperwork claiming we'd signed over the land. Then he called the handwriting expert to the stand. The expert, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Patel, explained how she'd analyzed the signature on the documents. "The signature is a clear forgery," she said. "It doesn't match any of the known samples of Mr. Joseph's handwriting." Next, Mark presented the whistleblower's evidence, the emails, memos, and recordings between Greg and Tom. He played one of the recordings for the court, and the room fell silent as Greg's voice filled the air. "We just need to make it look convincing," Greg said. "Once it's done, there's no way they can prove it's fake." The judge's expression was unreadable, but I could tell she wasn't impressed. Then it was Richard's turn. He tried to poke holes in our case, but the evidence was too strong. He even tried to argue that my grandpa had verbally agreed to transfer the land, a claim that made the judge raise an eyebrow. "Do you have any evidence to support that claim?" the judge asked. Richard hesitated. "No, Your Honor." After hours of testimony and arguments, the judge finally made her decision. "This is a clear case of fraud and corruption," she said. "The evidence presented by the plaintiffs is overwhelming. The forged documents are invalid, and the rezoning of the property is hereby revoked." She turned to Greg and Richard. "As for the HOA's actions, I'm referring this case to the district attorney for further investigation. This kind of behavior is unacceptable." It was over. We'd won. The fallout from the case was huge. Greg resigned as HOA president, and Tom was fired from his job at the county zoning office. The district attorney launched an investigation into the HOA's actions, and several other families came forward with similar stories. As for us, we finally had peace. The land was safe, and my grandpa's legacy was preserved. This fight has changed us. It's brought my family closer together, but it's also taken a toll. My dad's health is still a concern, and the stress of the legal battle will stay with us for a long time. But we're stronger because of it. We've learned the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter how powerful the opposition seems. Looking back, I can't believe everything we've been through. What started as a few annoying letters turned into a fight for justice, and we won. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's this: never underestimate the power of standing up for what's yours. Thank you to everyone who's followed this story and supported us along the way. Your encouragement has meant the world to us.